"You can stop looking nervous," my mother said across the conference table. "Your name isn't in the will." For half a second, I thought I had misheard her. Then Dad laughed. Not loudly, just enough to make the relatives sitting around Attorney Martin Reeves's office look at me. Mom leaned back in her chair. "I guess your grandmother finally understood who actually belonged to this family." My younger brother, Evan, gave an awkward little grin and looked down at the papers in front of him. Martin raised a hand. "Mrs. Hall, I haven't finished explaining the probate." Dad cut him off. "That's fine, we already know the important part." My stomach tightened. Grandma Alina had never promised me money, never told me I was inheriting anything. But I had spent the last few years driving her to appointments, handling her insurance paperwork, buying groceries, fixing things around her house. Dad was already talking about selling her lake house. "How soon can we list it?" he asked Martin. That hurt more than Mom's laughter. I was the one who had repaired the porch there after a storm. I was the one who drove Grandma out to the lake during her final summer because she said she wanted to see the sunset from the old deck one more time. Martin opened the will. Mom and Dad were named for a cash bequest. Evan was named for another. Then Martin turned the page. Still nothing about me. Mom's smile widened. That expression took me straight back through 32 years of being the daughter who was expected to help quietly, while Evan was treated like the future of the family. Dad tapped the table. "Nothing to say, Celine." I closed the folder in front of me. Apparently, Grandma already said what she wanted to say. Then I stood up. Mom called after me, "Don't make this dramatic." I kept walking. By the time I reached the hallway, Dad was already asking Martin whether the lake house could be sold before winter. I drove home believing it was finished. Grandma had excluded me. Maybe Mom and Dad had influenced her. Maybe they hadn't. Either way, I wasn't going back to beg for an inheritance. But after I left, Martin remained at the conference table, staring at Alina's estate file. Something inside it had stopped him cold. A separate instruction. A sealed document. And one question he suddenly needed answered. Why had Grandma ordered him to verify it only after her original will was read? By the time I got back to my apartment, the family group chat had already exploded. I didn't open it. Then a private message from Evan appeared. "Don't make this ugly. Mom says Grandma obviously had her reasons." I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then called him. He answered on the third ring. "Celine, did you know?" "Know what?" "That Mom was going to announce I wasn't in the will before Martin even finished reading it." He went quiet. That was answer enough. "Evan," he sighed, "Mom and Dad thought you were expecting something." "I never asked Grandma for anything." "I know." "Then why were they so sure I was getting nothing?" Another pause. Finally, he said, "They talked to Grandma about you." My grip tightened around the phone. "About what?" "They kept telling her you were doing fine, that you had your own career, your own apartment, your savings. Mom said you didn't need an inheritance." I stood completely still. For the first time since leaving Martin's office, the humiliation shifted into something else. Suspicion. How often? "I don't know." "Evan." "A lot, okay." Then he added, almost casually, "Mom's been talking about selling the lake house for months anyway." Before Grandma died. Silence. That landed harder than anything from the will reading. I lowered my voice. "You laughed today." "It wasn't like that." "You smiled. Everyone thought you'd been helping Grandma because you expected some kind of reward." I actually stopped breathing for a second. "When Grandma fell last year and couldn't manage stairs for 6 weeks, how many times did you visit?" "Celine." "Once, you visited once." "That's not fair." "I handled groceries, appointments, bills, repairs. I never asked her what she was leaving me." Evan snapped back. Then losing the inheritance shouldn't matter. I ended the call. No argument, no goodbye. Then I made a decision. I wasn't contesting Grandma's will because my feelings were hurt. If she had truly excluded me, I would live with it. Across town, Martin Reeves was making a very different decision. He contacted the witnesses, named on Aliner's later estate document. One by one, they verified their signatures. The document was legitimate. Martin turned to his assistant. Call every beneficiary from this morning. Tell them to come back. My phone lit up with *Martin Reeves*, just as the family group chat suddenly filled with the same message. Return to the law office, now. I didn't go back immediately. Mom called twice while I stood in my kitchen staring at Martin's missed call. Dad called next. Then Evan. Whatever had happened in that office, the people who had been laughing a few hours earlier suddenly wanted me very badly. I let every call ring. Mom, Dad, Evan, and several relatives reached Martin's office before I did. Dad walked in expecting paperwork. So what do you need from us? He asked. I've already spoken to a real estate agent about the lake house. Martin looked up sharply. You contacted an agent. Just preliminary conversations. We don't want the property sitting empty. Martin closed the file in front of him. Mr. Hall, you currently have no authority to sell that property. Mom frowned. What are you talking about? Martin gestured for everyone to sit. The document discussed this morning was Aliner's original will. We know, Mom said impatiently. No, Martin replied. You know part of her estate plan. Nobody spoke. Martin placed another folder on the table. Aliner later executed a codicil. Dad's confidence disappeared. A what? An amendment to her will. Mom pushed her chair forward. Then why wasn't this mentioned this morning? Because Aliner left specific instructions regarding its verification. Those instructions have now been completed. Dad shook his head. Someone manipulated her. Martin's expression hardened. Aliner's capacity was independently documented. The codicil was properly witnessed, and I have verified those witnesses. Evan finally spoke. Does it change the house? Martin paused. Everyone watched him. Then he said, it changes far more than the house. Mom immediately grabbed her phone. She called me. I declined. Dad called. Declined. Evan called twice. Then relatives who hadn't said one word, while my parents humiliated me, began calling too. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter again and again, until the screen was packed with notifications. Back in Martin's conference room, Dad started to speak about the lake house again. Martin stopped him. I strongly suggest you stop making plans with property that may not belong to you. I finally answered one call. Not Mom's. Not Dad's. Martin. Celine, he said, I need you to return to my office. The codicil directly affects your legal interests. That was all I needed to hear. When I walked back into the conference room, the difference was immediate. Nobody laughed. Mom stood first. Her voice had changed completely. Celine, whatever Grandma did, we need to handle this as a family. I looked at her. Hours earlier, she had announced in front of everyone that I didn't belong. Now she wanted unity. I'd rather hear what Grandma wrote first. Dad leaned forward. Nobody is saying you shouldn't. We just don't want anyone taking advantage of this situation. Martin opened Aliner's file. For clarity, Aliner took several precautions when she executed this codicil. She requested independent witnesses and obtained documentation regarding her mental capacity. Mom folded her arms. Martin continued. She also discussed concerns about possible family pressure concerning her estate. Dad's face tightened. What exactly does that mean? It means Aliner wanted her intentions documented clearly. Martin explained that the codicil changed ownership of assets my parents had apparently already begun planning around. Evan rubbed his hands together beneath the table. Finally, he looked at me. I was counting on my inheritance, Celine. For what? He hesitated. Debt. Mom jumped in. And your father and I had retirement plans. Selling the lake house was part of that. There it was. They had built financial plans around property they didn't yet own. Dad pointed toward the folder. Before this goes any further, Celine should agree not to take advantage of whatever is in there. No. His eyebrows lifted. I kept my voice level. I'm not promising anybody anything before I hear what Grandma actually instructed. Martin placed the authenticated codicil in the center of the table. The cash bequests contained in Aliner's original will remain, he said, but the disposition of several major assets was substantially changed. Mom reached for the document. Martin pulled it back. Everyone will hear it properly. My phone buzzed. A message from Mom appeared on the screen. Whatever that paper says, remember who your real family is. I looked from the message to her. Then Martin unfolded the codicil and began to read. Martin adjusted the document in front of him. The monetary bequests in Aliner Hall's original will remain unchanged. Mom released a small breath. Dad leaned back. Martin continued. Marion and Douglas Hall will receive the cash amount previously specified. Evan Hall will receive his specified cash bequest. Evan nodded, but Martin wasn't finished. However, Aliner's codicil changes the disposition of her remaining major assets. The room went silent. Martin looked at me. The lake house, owned free and clear, passes entirely to Celine Hall. Mom froze. Dad sat forward. What? Martin kept reading. Aliner's investment account also passes to Celine Hall. Dad's chair scraped against the floor. Read that again. There's more, Martin said. Nobody moved. Aliner's controlling ownership interest in Hall property holdings, including its interests in several long-term rental properties, passes to Celine Hall. Evan stared down at the table. Mom looked at me as if I had somehow written the document myself. Martin continued with Aliner's explanation. Grandma had documented that I consistently helped her without asking what I would receive in return. She had also heard repeated conversations about what would happen to her property after her death, especially plans to sell assets she was still alive to own. That was why she had been so careful. Independent witnesses. Documentation of her mental capacity. Separate instructions to Martin. The sealed codicil. Grandma hadn't been confused. She had been protecting her decision. Mom finally found her voice. Your grandmother never meant for you to keep all of that yourself. I looked directly at her. Then why did she put it in writing? Nothing. Not one person answered. Dad turned on Martin. We'll challenge it. You're entitled to obtain independent legal advice, Martin replied. But Mrs. Hall anticipated that possibility. Her capacity was documented, the codicil was properly executed and independently witnessed, and the document remained under appropriate custody. Dad's jaw tightened. And the lake house is not yours to sell. That ended the conversation with the real estate agent Dad had already contacted. He had no authority to list Grandma's property, and the sale he and Mom had been planning disappeared before it ever started. Their retirement plans had been built around money that was never theirs. Evans still received exactly what Grandma had designated, but it wasn't enough to erase the debt he had quietly expected an inheritance to solve. Then came the pressure. Mom called the next morning. We need to redistribute some of this fairly. Grandma already distributed it. Celine were your parents. I know. That was the entire problem. For years, those words had been enough to make me surrender. This time they were. I kept every asset Grandma intentionally left me. The relatives noticed too. People who had watched Mom and Dad laugh when they thought I had been excluded now knew they had been planning to sell Grandma's property before the estate process was even finished. Mom tried telling everyone they had simply been surprised. Fewer people believed her now. I didn't campaign against my parents or argue in the family group chat. I simply stopped helping them rewrite what had happened. Our relationship became limited and formal. Evan contacted me later. This time, he didn't mention his debt. "I shouldn't have laughed," he said, "especially after everything you did for Grandma." I accepted the apology. I didn't pretend. One apology repaired years of behavior. Months later, I stood on the porch of Grandma's lake house, the same porch I had once repaired for her. I never sold it. I hired professionals to manage the rental properties held through Hall Property Holdings, and I kept Grandma's investments properly managed instead of treating them like sudden spending money. For the first time in my life, my parents couldn't use guilt, approval, or the promise of belonging to control my decisions. I had walked out of Martin's office, believing Grandma had erased me. Instead, she had quietly prepared for the exact behavior that appeared after she was gone. And I finally understood something bigger than the inheritance. I didn't need my parents to decide whether I belonged. They laughed because they thought my name wasn't in Grandma's will. By the time the lawyer finished reading what Grandma had actually signed, nobody in that room was laughing anymore.